All right, Tara.
Great. I'm following my other co-leads of the GHG committee on the third presentation here today on a number of things we're doing in the sort of climate change greenhouse gas realm of things. So appreciate all the work that they've done. I'm going to be talking here about something that came out of the executive order that we're following up on, which is applying a GHG lens to investment and project selection decisions within the STIP, the State Transportation Improvement Program. So I think you know me, I'm Tara Weidner with the ODOT Climate Office. I previously was with TPOW for quite some time, so not unfamiliar with the crowd here. Okay, so the triggers for the work, as I mentioned, I think we did form a climate office and recognize that there's, significant impact of our work on GHG emissions. The executive order obviously prompted that and had us push towards the STIP. But we realized that the investments we make do matter, and so that's triggering our work. So the STIP is pretty much a super complex thing, and it's sort of the bread and butter of funding a lot of things in the state, and so you can't recreate that to try to put a lens on it. So we had to dive into the deep end and try to figure out where we might, make a difference here and what tables we wanted to show up at. So we ended up finding 3 locations that we think are good points for being at the table and influencing decision making. We call these phase 1, 2, and 3. The first one actually was completed last fall, actually December OTC Commission meeting, where there's a decision about where to put the money that ODOT has within its influence, because a lot of money sort of passes through, say, from feds or from local projects, but from what was in the local the hands of ODOT, that the commission could allocate. And really this is, the fix it versus enhance versus non-highway. So there's 5 buckets that they're deciding where money should go. So no project at this point, just how much money to put in. And then phase 2 is saying, okay, now that you have those buckets, let's select projects. And they start with, a long list and narrow that down. So we wanted to be at the table for phase 2, and we're currently in the process of doing that. And then what's ahead of us is phase 3. And in phase 3, we're trying to take a little bit different tact and say, well, the first 2, we only had influence in certain areas, but phase 3, we really want to know the impact of the whole STIP itself, sort of that footprint. And so we're taking a little bit different analysis approach with that and more broader look at it. And I'll dive into each of these as we talk about it. It's also important to know that we're building this as we drive the bus, as we drive it, is the analogy that we put in there. And it's been a fun ride so far. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to identify, we were asked to do climate mitigation. We also knew that what's important as well is looking at adaptation. And so we just sort of broadened it and said, well, for that first decision, when they're figuring out where to put funding, there's a lot of reasons why we fund things at ODOT, and climate is one of those, and we need to add that lens and make sure it's showing up, but we can't quite let go of all the others. So at least for the first phase, we were able to do a multi-criteria analysis, and we looked at what are the key outcomes to look at for that, the trade-offs. So in addition to climate mitigation, which carries through all 3 of the phases, we looked in phase 1 at these other outcomes that reflect things we have in our plans and the Oregon Transportation Plan and a number of other strategic documents at the agency and with our commission. In phase 1, we had a couple decisions we wanted to do. We needed to know how much money went into the programs that they were going to, allocate to. And so we were looking at the past STIP, the 21-24, when they're deciding on the current STIP, which is 24 to 27. So that was able to help us establish a bootstrap, a baseline of relationships. We needed to know what types of projects were funded in each of those programs. Did they support, and then how did those investments in those projects support the key outcomes I just mentioned? So we needed to establish these relationships so that we could then run some scenario analysis with the commission for them to be informed about what it would mean to fund different allocations across those program areas. So what we needed to do to the process we came up with that, we started by collecting some additional data that wasn't available. So each of the projects, this is now looking at the prior STIP, we could look at those projects that were in the STIP and we could know how much dollars went to those. And we wanted to break it out by, we have, I think, 24 attributes or something like that. Because those attributes then support one or more of those goals, or maybe sometimes work in opposite direction. So the first thing we had to do was to have our project dollars broken out by these attributes. So we asked the program managers to help us do that with the programs in the prior STIP. And so you can see here, they're kind of checking a box. Yes, this is true. And how much or what portion of the project went to funding each of these elements. So for instance, project A is a bridge expansion, but it expanded the road by a certain amount, which costed a certain element. It had some safety information and maybe it provided a bus stop on it as well. As opposed to project C, which is more operational and maybe had some rumble strips on it. So these are what we're asking, additional information than what was there before, just breaking out that total project dollar. And that's about all the information you have at a pretty early stage. So even though it seems pretty simple, it was important for us to be aware of what is available at the point that we were trying to intercept. So we wanted to turn those investments, those project attribute dollars, into support for the key outcomes. So given the project cost, that was broken out by those attributes, each attribute would score a good or positive, bad or negative or neutral for each outcome area. For example, if the project shown here, if it had road expansion attribute dollars associated with it and expanded capacity, it would score negative for climate mitigation, as you can see in the chart with the blue bars. You can see also it scores negative for state of good repair because it means more roads that would need to be maintained, but it would score positively for congestion relief. So then in the right table, you can see as we sum this across all projects, we can see how the STIP or a particular program within this STIP supported various outcomes. So that led us to relationships as shown here. So here we've got the 6 outcome areas as our 6 sort of quadrants here. And this is based on those relationships mining the past STIP that are embedded in these charts. The circles identify the influence of the various funding programs on that particular outcome. For instance, the Fix-It program, let's see, if we look at climate adaptation, the Fix-It program is very large and is pretty directly correlated to improving climate adaptation and resilience. Whereas if we go to the upper left, where mitigation is furthered most by the non-highway funding, the transit and bike ped investments, and actually has a slight negative impact from roadway capacity of enhanced funding. Similarly, state of good repair in the lower right also has a negative for enhanced funding because of the additional roads to maintain. In contrast, safety really gets benefit from funding from all investment areas. So these relationships really take a program view, aggregating across many projects, and while still recognizing that a single project typically reflects a mix supporting multiple outcome areas. So here we're looking at the scenario planning we did with the Oregon Transportation Commission. And we started by setting a background. So you can see we have sort of a report card in there with grades, and really needed to set the stage that the agency's revenues will only go so far. You can see the best grade there is a B for safety. So then we did this scenario planning effort, and I'm not showing you all the options, only the final scenario there. I think we did 6 to 10 scenarios. And, it ended up that we did have a modest but historical increase in funding for the bike ped non-highway program bucket. That boost in funding has allowed the creation of a strategic bike ped program area rather than mostly leveraging off existing projects. So that was a good win for the program. So then we move to phase two. So here we now have a project program area, like say bike ped or non-highway, I should say, and there have many projects on that list. They start with what they call like 150% list, and then they narrow it down to 100% list that's sort of finalized and moves forward. So what we're trying to do is provide feedback on that 150 list so that they can start to choose projects that might have more advancing the goal of GHG mitigation. So we share the type of chart to the right where we use the index that I was talking about previously to identify where projects show up. So they can identify the dollar attributes of their program, of their project that they're putting in the 150% list. We score those positive and negatively or neutrally, as I noted earlier, and then they show up on this chart. And so they can identify, ooh, some of these are in the red, how can we move them forward? And we have those kind of dialogues, which is really what you're trying to flag at this point. We also compare this back to the previous STIP and have the same kind of bar there of, you know, red to green, and we can look at projects in the past that have done well and what attributes they might have had that could be added to current projects. Typically, the problem here tends to be money to add those additional items, but we're at least having, I think, the right conversations, and sometimes things are able to be adjusted and so forth. Okay, and most of these conversations have really been on ODOT programs. It's been challenging to just get in and be a part of this complex process. Each program has its own timeline and so forth. But so we're getting our feet wet here and hope to expand a little bit more in the future. So if we look at the timeline for phase 2 and 3, we did an online data collection survey for all those program managers to provide their initial attribute and project cost data. We did those bar charts red to green to get the index reporting to them, and did some verification. And so they've gone out to field scope those, and then given that the GHG index is one part of that conversation, they are narrowing this down right now for the 100% list that will move forward. At that point, we will enter phase 3 and focus on phase 2 and phase 3 have focused just on the GHG mitigation, only so much bandwidth here. And so we're going to focus on phase 3 when that 100% list hits. And the idea is to capture a more quantitative, less on this more simplified index, but moving to a quantitative level for phase 3 and inform the report that goes out when the draft STIP is shared for public review. And I have a chart here that's very draft, but just kind of shows the complexity of what we're doing. You can see that each row here is a variety of the type of projects that might show up in the STIP. And our main thing is to try to make this repeatable over time and be consistent across the state. And so we're probably going to use more statewide tools and do things on a programmatic basis systematically where we can. And so we've got a variety of tools that we're listing here, and we're in the process of trying to figure out how best to do that. I think the key point of our kickoff about a month ago was we have about 40 minutes per project to analyze it. So we're probably not going to use a whole lot of the regional travel models, one, because of the diversity across the state, and because of the time required to do so. But we may in some cases, particularly some of those major projects. So just a little bit more on the index itself. A lot of people ask questions, particularly about this. I put the formula in there. So a project score would be based on the attribute dollars that I mentioned. Well, there's scores to each attribute, right? So that positive, negative. And in phase 2, we're using the NCHRP work recently that has a scale that's maybe just not -1 and to +1, but can go a little bit higher. So that's the E value for each of those attributes. That then gets multiplied by the cost of the project tied to that attribute. So that's the small v is the cost that sum up to the large V, which is the total cost of the project. And then there's a weighting factor really for how much VMT is affected. And really this ties back down to the geography to a large extent, whether this is in a MPO with a lot of travel versus a small urban area versus a rural area, in terms of amplifying the effects of the mitigation happening. So with that, just wrapping it up. We are, moving out of phase 2, moving to phase 3, and we will report that as a draft when it comes out, and then the final eventually. And we do anticipate a continued monitoring effort on how the decisions are playing out. So the STIP is put into our data warehouse, and we can go back and see if those dollars are being spent the way the decisions made at OTC intended, and keep track of that. We also want to move back upstream to where the initial project lists happen, especially as we think of things that are not necessarily at the state program level, but more maybe in the TSPs or the RTPs. I think it's going to be important to go back upstream. So we're starting some conversations on that front. And then we're also toying with how we can pursue strategic and opportunistic approaches to identify particular projects or mitigations that can add GHG reduction elements. I guess the other thing I would note is we do want to expand from just a strictly greenhouse gas emission reduction to also an adaptation measure. And we noted when we did the multi-criteria in phase 1 that those don't always move in the same direction, which makes it interesting. It's often aligned with the fix-it and resiliency dollars, but not always. We are creating some adaptation vulnerability maps across the state, so we'll probably focus on particular areas. All right, so with that, I'll open it up to questions. Try to look at the chat box, see if anything's there. Nope. Looks like, Mike, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. So what comes to mind when I see your methodology is the TPR rule changes and what cities will need to do as far as developing their illustrative lists to try to meet the targets. So in your mind, do you see cities or local jurisdictions potentially using a modified methodology that you're using, at least maybe for an initial compliance with that rule until other methodologies are improved?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things in the CFEC rulemaking for TSP level analysis. So I think it's looking at some, once those lists are created, looking at those project level and trying to do a score, trying to do an index like this. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about this particular index that we're creating for the STIP could be applied. And I think there's been some concern that especially for the smaller projects, this kind of data, even at the very simplified, how much is your project going to cost, and how much of it is going to, the sort of 24 elements we're talking about. How much is it a bike lane versus how much is it lane capacity versus others? Sometimes it's just money towards a project. And as we get to larger projects, I think it's actually important for us to do this. So I think the push to have that data available is probably worthwhile. So I think there has been room in the rule in its draft language anyway to say that some kind of index could be done, could lean on the STIP, could be an equivalent or similar sort of index at a local level. I know in the city of Portland and has done some things in the past, the city and Metro both have tried some things within their TSP to look at more qualification, sorry, not quantified, non-quantitative, qualitative, thank you, that's the word I was looking for, qualitative more like asking questions. Does it have this, and getting a score for it, right? So I think there are other ways to do this, especially as we get to smaller projects. Cody, I don't know if you have any thoughts, given you are much closer to the language and the rule and such.
Well, I was just going to note that the City of Portland, Peter's here, so he can talk about it, but he does that for City of Portland and shared that with the City of Eugene, who shared that with us, and it's pretty simple. Honestly, what the City of Eugene is doing is a spreadsheet level analysis to do this very similar work and not nearly so complicated. So that was kind of the genesis of us asking, we'd like you to just kind of look at these two things, climate and equity, as you go about scoring projects. And we don't specify that you have to go into, whatever level of detail you're comfortable with, but we know that there's very simple tools to apply to that now.
And I guess if projects are headed towards the STIP, ultimately, it only makes sense that we would start at the ground floor and try to move towards this GHG index that would be applied there, but not all of them are headed in that direction. Peter? Harley?
Thanks, Tara. Good presentation. Very, very helpful. And I know that there's a lot in there that we could learn from as we update our TSP and attempt to use better tools the next time around. One of the questions that I had is, this primarily focuses, as far as I can tell, and one of the things coming out of our both the vision eval work, but also some of the other research we're doing, is that policy decisions can be extraordinarily impactful in terms of reducing or increasing GHG emissions in transportation. I'm just wondering if as part of your evaluation, you looked at policy changes, whether those are pricing changes or other types of policies that, and whether that was part of either the initial analysis or the work that you're doing now to potentially mitigate some of the negative impacts from some projects.
Yeah, it's it's a good question. I'm here speaking about the STIP, and the STIP is all about investment, right? So there's very little about those policies. I mean, there might be toll gantries or something, but it's really more of a political will to do those policies than it is an investment. So I don't think there's been in the STIP discussion of that, because it's not really relevant. But it would be in, say, the CFEC rulemaking.
Okay, I just encourage us, all of us collectively, because this has been one of the big lessons learned, certainly for me, and I think perhaps for the Bureau as a whole, the power of policy decisions to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that as we, whether it's ODOT, PBOT, any of the MPOs, or cities or counties, as we think about updating our TSPs, RTPs, and other policy documents, how do we better incorporate policy decisions into our decision making, along with project evaluation, so policy evaluation? And I have some initial thoughts on it, but they're pretty formative at this point in time. But I'd just like to put that out as something for the whole OMSC to be thinking about, since it's clearly on our doorstep right now.
I don't know, Brian, did you have thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, I just go back to our storm diagram. I mean, really, I think the challenge in this universe right now is, it's like, I think you hit it, Tara, with, we're trying to build a bus as we're driving it down the road. So when I look at this, and I look at the next, let's say, few years, I think this is really what you're kind of doing is sort of a square peg in a round hole, right? You're trying to get something at the end of the process and to inform. Here's this list. There's been a bunch of criteria that people use to get to the STIP list, so you're now trying to help inform with what we have in there now. how can we use information, if I'm understanding right, Tara, to inform that decision process to get like from the 150 to the 100. I think the good thing about the timing of this is, we are starting up our policy and long range planning efforts, the Oregon Transportation Plan and the OHP. And I think that's where we're really going to use tools like Vision Eval, et cetera, to push those levers. Now, we did some of that with the STS already, so I think we have a lot of foundation. But I think the challenge we have right now is sort of everybody tends to look at their criteria, So I'm hoping in the OTP and the OHP processes, this will be added as sort of the multi-criteria evaluation piece. But I think at that strategic planning process, that's where most of those policy levers like pricing get tested. Now that being said, we have some big projects in the Portland area that, we are looking at various pricing mechanisms along with bottleneck removal kind of stuff. So in those big projects, I think that's being done. But that's kind of with our storm, the strategic, then the tactical. There's fewer policy things and that you're going to test typically in a system plan than you do up at a regional kind of planning effort. By the time you get to a project level, most of those things, it's a questions of which ones you're going to implement, I think. So I don't know if that was a good answer or not, but that's kind of partly what I think longer term, when these all circle back, hopefully it'll get into a strategic through sort of a tactical and reporting, et cetera, process that makes sense. And they're all those levels are informed by this is one of the criteria, I think. Yeah.
And I would say our tools can do all those policies, right? So they can be in the TSP and in the RTPs. And in fact, I think the rulemaking is pushing a scenario that's called an illustrative scenario that looks at and has some criteria for how much, meeting the GHG target, basically. And it's asking you to assume a high pricing scenario, because part of the STS, the roadmap for our greenhouse gas reduction, is that those pricing policies are put in place, that we fully cover our roads, which we're not now, right? We're only at about half. And we have a cap and trade bill that's covering recovering carbon costs and so forth. So those pricing, if we would play out that STS vision, that's, we talked about getting to our roadmap, then you would have higher pricing. So the rulemaking is asking you to have a separate scenario that would put those in place. So you would be running with some higher pricing. So I think it's pushing us to look at a future where that is the case. And as your findings have shown, those sticks work in tandem with the carrots to really make the carrots shine, and see the movement on both, vehicular miles and emissions, and both, for health and GHG. So I think it's important for us to start thinking about that future, because we have to, find a new way to fund our roads, as well as try to think about the climate. And those things mean that we start to have to pay our way a little bit more, which will have travel behavior effects.
Thanks for that's a very good substantive answer from both of you. And I know that Cody knows that I've been encouraging us to incorporate policy into the TPR, the updated rules as well. Just to quickly shift, and then I'll stop. But I'm wondering, a lot of times we talk about the information that we present, but not how the decision makers respond to it. And I'm just curious, based on your experience thus far, what have you learned about how the commission is responding to the information that you presented through phases 1 and 2?
Yes, they were most involved in phase 1, and it was a tough conversation. There was a lot of public opinion about it. I think basically we sort of, were able to make a transparent process, and people were able to weigh in on one scenario versus another, which, isn't always the case. And so I think they wrung their hands a lot, because there just isn't a lot of revenue from the current streams, gas taxes and so forth. And so, they were just sort of hemming and hawing that this isn't fair. We don't have enough revenue to do what we need to do. We need to cover safety. We need to keep the lights on in the house and, the foundation strong. But we also need to tackle, GHG and other things. So that was not unneeded conversation to have, right? I mean, that really is the situation, and they were put in the commission to answer the tough questions, and we were just basically trying to like set the table so that they could have that conversation. Phase 2 has been a little bit more behind the hood in terms of, you know, program managers making decisions on those projects. And I have to say, I think that's been a little bit tougher to kind of get in there, and especially because the funding's not there to structure to sort of leverage and add some of these things. So we'll see how much progress we can make on that decision point. But I think the first one was very public. And I think, you know, that's important. Those are the decisions we need to make right now.
Very good. Thank you much.
Alex, you've been raising your hand. Do you have thoughts on this or the prior topic?
Well, I'm trying hard I can't help myself, I guess, a little bit. I did want to jump in, just a quick plug. You know, I don't know if we're going to be successful yet, but just hearing the conversation, you know, as we're approaching the RTP, we're trying really hard to marry the revenue stream along with the investments. And so, you know, again, I'm not sure exactly how the OTP will play out and if we'll be successful, but you know, I'd like, you know, I think the benefit there, or the opportunity here, is that Oregon is uniquely short in its transportation funding just to maintain the system as is. And so we're being, you know, this GHG conversation is stating that, you know, we need to increase pricing and increase policy decisions to go, you know, to create the shiny carrots, as you said, Tara. And so, and so we have this, and as you just described, we have these decision makers who are really frustrated because they have to make a bunch of impossible decisions about which areas to fund with very short funding. And so, anyways, the OTP is going to, you know, is linking the investment piece with the policy piece so that there's, you know, the idea is that there's going to be different investment amounts depending on how the policy decisions are. So you can get those more satisfying investment packages, but it requires the policy hooks along with it. So in my mind, you know, that's the clear path forward. I don't know if we'll get there, but that's the clear path forward. And then ultimately, if the OTP can show success, you know, I think that potentially change the game for RTP fiscally constrained. You know, maybe there's fiscally constrained with different policy, you know, packages. And so you have different policy packages potentially, which allow you to get to different fiscally constrained levels. I know that's all kind of like, I know I'm entering like a whole bunch of hands going up and like showing me how issues that with that. So sorry for starting a fire and running, but I just, in my mind, to have the policy discussion, you need to link investment with policy.
Policy on revenues that are generated and the travel behavior that responses from those. And part of it, I think, is to identify, you know, there's actual some positive benefits for a lot of our goals in doing that. And then there's obviously positive benefits of having revenue to spend on some of these things. So part of it is to run scenarios with our tools that can elucidate that alternative future. That's not where we're at now.
Okay, any other STIP process related questions for Tara? To put some boundaries around expanding too
or just
far
anything,
here.
I guess, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Tara.